everybody! Going to therapy is hard enough, and it doesn't make it any easier when you don't like your therapist. As a therapist myself, I cannot stress how important it is for you to do research before you go into your initial consultation. A lot of us are looking for certain qualities or experiences that our therapists inhabit simply so we can feel understood. And in some cases, so we can feel seen. But when it comes to mental health, does the race or ethnicity of your therapist really matter? Today we're going to be opening a conversation about choosing a therapist that has the same cultural background as you. Let's get to it. Okay, first things first. What is your process of finding a therapist? When researching mental health professionals, there's a few things that you have to consider. 1, do they accept your insurance? 2, what is their specialty or area of expertise? That could look like eating disorders, family therapy, PTSD, even substance use. 3, what theory do they use? This ties in with their styles and what types of interventions they'll be using during your sessions. And then 4, the secondary factors. Race, gender, sexual orientation, are they a parent? Religious affiliation. When deciding which therapist is best for you, the race or ethnicity should never be the sole factor of your decision making, especially when all you have to go off of is their photo and their bio. Typically, in this bio, we talk about our specialties and our approach to therapy. I'm not gonna tell you where I grew up or my personal cultural experiences because this isn't about me. You may assume all of that based on my photo, but keep that in mind because I'm gonna touch on that a little bit later. Aside from these basic factors, you really need to think about what are you looking for? And I mean beyond the superficial level. Are you looking to just be heard? Do you want someone to listen to you without judgment? Maybe some guidance on how to manage work stress. Do you just want to learn how to cope in healthier ways? For example, if you're just looking for someone to listen, what's the difference of being heard by a therapist who is a person of color versus someone who's white? And if you go and say,
well, a therapist who's also Filipino understands my experience.
Okay, fair. But then at that point, it's beyond being superficial and you're looking for more than just your voice being heard. Again, what are you truly looking for? Start there. Okay, time to be real with yourself. You walk into a room of 20 strangers and you notice in the corner, there's a group of individuals of the same race as you just chatting along. Are you or are you not tempted to mingle with that group first? People typically associate with others that they perceive similar to themselves. Naturally, when we're around those that are similar to us, we're more likely to trust them than those who we perceive to be different. We trust that there won't be any of the negative biases or negative stereotyping because we assume those other individuals share the same worldviews. So a minute ago, I brought up choosing a therapist based on their photo. The harsh reality is that clients and therapists from the same cultural background may be completely different people. I mean, it sounds obvious when you say it like that, right? For instance, imagine you just immigrated to the US from Korea. You're having a really difficult time adjusting to the new culture and then you decide to seek therapy. And voila! You just found yourself a Korean therapist. Perfect! Initial consultation rolls around and you come to find that your Korean therapist is actually 5th generation Korean American and they have completely different values than you do. You end up only sharing ethnic backgrounds. If you rely on the presumption of similarity based on race alone, you may be more disappointed. Similar cultural roots don't guarantee a better bond. Just because someone looks like you doesn't mean that they'll get you. So let's take a second to talk about therapists and their education. Multicultural counseling in graduate school. Nowadays, therapists are required to complete a multicultural course as part of their education. This helps in taking steps towards being culturally competent. But keep in mind, this is not just white therapists understanding clients of color. You may be Asian with a black therapist or Arabian with a Hispanic therapist. There's this idea that cultural competence is for white people to understand people of color. It's more than that. There's a variety of terms used to reference culture in mental health treatment. Multicultural competence, culturally sensitive, culturally competent, or even culturally responsive. Anyway, it's pretty much a model for us to develop the skills to work. But not only skills, it's for us to gain knowledge, self-awareness, because then we can make working with diverse populations more effective. And personally, if I may, that just barely scratches the surface of a deeper issue. In an article titled Relational Humility, Conceptualizing and Measuring Humility as Personal Judgment, the authors examine cultural humility, which simply means we have an accurate view of ourselves while respecting others without superiority. The way I see it, there's a huge difference between a therapist making assumptions during a session instead of saying, hey, I don't completely understand that. Would you mind telling me more about it? I feel that is when you know a therapist is culturally competent. They're opening a dialogue for you to explain your actual experiences and how you interpreted those experiences, rather than reading, okay, this is what happens in Asian culture, so this is how Asians typically act. Again, this is so important. Just because we go through the same experiences doesn't mean we interpret it the same way or even process it the same way. Learning about cultural competence is very different from practicing it. Being culturally competent includes a therapist being mindful of their own personal biases, however you say it, checking themselves, and then learning about different cultures and religions from the perspective of the client. But most importantly, being humble throughout the process. So what do? I know this all sounds like a lot and you may be more conflicted than you were before clicking on this video. And to make it even worse, I'm gonna just say, it depends. Finding the right therapist is no easy feat, so please do the research. If race or ethnic background is truly that important to you regarding your therapist, it's okay to ask them questions in the initial consultation. Again, this is your process. So maybe you're like, I have no idea what to ask. Here's a few questions that you might find helpful. What is your experience working with blank population? With the Asian population? With minorities? However you want to word that. How do you work with clients who have experienced racism or discrimination? What is your training on being culturally competent, or how do you approach providing this type of care? And then lastly, what's your comfort level around discussing topics such as privilege, immigration related issues, etc. As a therapist myself, I totally understand the desire to have a therapist that you feel culturally connected to. When you find someone that can relate to your experiences, where you don't have to continually explain yourself and your background, you spend more time addressing your root concerns. But just to play devil's advocate for a moment, does that connection tie too much to comfort? Because therapy is not always going to be comfortable. Having a therapist of a different background may provide you with completely new perspectives that you never thought of. Those may even challenge your way of thinking. But that may be really daunting to some people. It all goes back to my original question. What are you truly looking for? I want to touch on transference and countertransference for a moment. These are two extremely important concepts in therapy for both the client and for the therapist. I thought I'd briefly touch on it because not many of my clients are aware of what it is, and race sometimes plays a role in these concepts. So let's start with transference. When you break down the word, you get transfer, which simply means going from one place to another. In psychology, transference is when a client redirects their feelings from a person in their life to the therapist. They project their feelings onto us just as they would that individual in their life. And transference could be positive or negative, but it is something that should be addressed in session. Okay, so an example, in case that's still confusing. A client gets angry at me when talking about an abusive person in their life. Or a client says that they admire me as they're telling me how much I remind them of their close friends. And if it still doesn't make sense to you, maybe I remind you of an Asian person that influenced racial trauma in your life, and then that causes you to treat me differently. It happens. And then there's countertransference, and it's just the opposite. It's when I, the therapist, transfer my feelings to the client. People forget, therapists are humans. We have emotions. We've gone through things ourselves, but the session isn't about us. In sessions, clients may bring up some trauma in their life and that causes me to react. And then my reaction may influence the outcome of the session. Maybe they said something that reminded me of my own trauma. Examples for this may look a little bit different. Lack of boundaries, inappropriate self-disclosure from the therapist, or even offering advice. And you're probably like, okay, well, how does this relate to race or ethnicity? There's such a thing as cultural countertransference or transference. Especially in the US, there's so many subjective biases. Biases, what is it? It's the same concept, it just includes culture. So yeah, that's today's video. In the end, it's entirely up to you. This is your therapeutic process. I just wanted to create this conversation because there's this idea and false sense of hope for a lot of individuals that go to therapy that if they find someone who's just like them, everything's gonna be better. And that's not always the case. If you have gone to therapy before, my question to you is, if your therapist was similar or different to you, how did that impact your therapeutic process? Let us know. If you're comfortable, of course. Or maybe you have some insight for individuals that are going to therapy for the first time. Let us know. Let's help each other out here. So feel free to subscribe. If not, feel free to follow me on Instagram. My handle is intricate. Otherwise, I'll see you at the next one. Thank you. Bye.